Hello, I'm Glenn Ford. Welcome to World War II, a personal journey. We're about to continue our look at this war through the eyes of the people who were there 50 years ago. In Italy, at the famous Battle of Monte Cassino, in France, on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, with Douglas MacArthur on his triumphant return to the Philippines, and at the Battle of the Bulge. Now, you'll recognize many of our honorees: Senator Daniel Inouye, William Manchester, Eli Wallach. We'll also hear from heroes and heroines we all should know, and they'll share with us their personal memories of World War II. At the beginning of 1944, our objective on the Italian front was Rome. We had to battle our way up the boot of Italy at places like Anzio and Monte Cassino. Life photographer Carl Meidens and cartoonist Bill Mauldin were both there. The beaches at Anzio were the site of a daring Allied landing designed to circumvent German defenses around Rome. But the Germans quickly sent in fresh divisions, and Anzio turned into a long and bloody stalemate. At Monte Cassino, high atop a hill, sat the Abbey of St. Benedict, a monastery founded in the 6th century. This architectural and historical treasure blocked the route to Rome from the south and was also a potential fortress for German troops thought to be hiding within its walls. We dropped leaflets warning the monks and our Italian friends of the imminent bombing of the monastery.
We were divided even then during the war whether we should be destroying the monastery at the top of the mountain. And it was one of the bloodiest battles Americans and their allies. Remember that it was not just us who took that great mountain mass at Monte Cassino. Especially it involved the fighting troops of Free Poland, the British, the Australians, all took terribly heavy losses.
On February the 15th, 1944, B-17 bombers attacked Monte Cassino, which proved to be a tough stop along the road to Rome.
It was a bad place. It was very dangerous and very, again, I didn't see any point in deliberately getting killed. I mean, what would happen to my drawing? So the casino was a very, very dangerous place to be.
In wartime, a soldier must be trained and prepared to kill another human being. Senator Daniel Inouye tells about his first experience.
The first time was in June of 1944. It was in Italy, on our way to Rome. We participated in the battle to liberate Rome. I was then a sergeant, and I had a little patrol to perform, a reconnaissance patrol. And in that patrol, while walking along the mountainside, I happened to look at the next mountain, and there on the top of that mountain, on the crest, was this German. He's got his helmet on, and he's squatting. He's actually doing his morning chore. And I said, "That's mine." As though I had seen a deer, and I said, "That's mine." And they all slinked down, very quiet. And I very deliberately and methodically adjusted my scope so that it would take into consideration the distance. I very deliberately aimed. One shot, bingo. He was gone. I had no feeling of remorse. In fact, it was a feeling of accomplishment. when one considers the training we had gone through on hating the Germans, that to get rid of them would be the greatest thing one can accomplish. In fact, the men who were with me all came by, pat my back to say, that was terrific, that was terrific. And one of them said, gee, why didn't you give me the opportunity, you know? But I said, I saw it first. And we're all young men. I was then 19, and the others must have been 21, 22.
On June the 4th, 1944, under General Mark Clark, we marched into Rome. The few Germans who remained were taken prisoner. Romans rejoiced at the city's liberation. Some showed their appreciation in more personal ways, always appreciated by the GI. Rome was the first capital of an Axis power to be captured. In May 1944, Hitler expected the Allies to invade northern Europe at the Pas de Calais in France. But the landings would take place on June the 6th, 1944, on the beaches of Normandy. From there, we would begin to cut a path of destruction into the heart of the Third Reich. The invasion was the biggest amphibious operation undertaken by any army in any war. Hitler was caught in a classic scenario for defeat, a two-front war, with the Russians closing in on the east and the Allies about to attack from the west. We had the air superiority we needed, the invasion fleet on alert, and we had the right man for the job. At the end of 1943, President Roosevelt had announced the appointment of 53-year-old General Dwight David Eisenhower as Supreme Commander of the Allied invasion of Europe.
I think Eisenhower was obviously an excellent soldier, a fine military strategist. I think Eisenhower was also a good politician. Everybody assumes that when he ran for president, that he was just a military man with no knowledge of politics. But, you know, my view is entirely different. My view is that any man who becomes chief of staff of the Army, who becomes a five-star general, is a hell of a good politician.
Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a series of strategically planned coastal fortifications, was designed to thwart an Allied attack. It ran the length of northern Europe's Atlantic coast. Preparing for an invasion of this size was no simple matter. Apart from training the men, much of England had to be transformed into a giant warehouse of war supplies. General Eisenhower, Ike to his troops, made the rounds offering last words of advice and inspiration to the young men, ready to put their months of rigorous training to the test. They all knew many would never make it back. Gabriel Howe was one of the millions under Nazi occupation waiting for the invasion.
We were, of course, waiting every night for D-Day. We knew the German kept telling us they were not. And after 4 years, we were beginning to be a little skeptical. But we knew the Allied troops. We knew the British would, and the Americans would come. So we listened every night to the messages. They were messages for 2 hours on a BBC. And the message we were looking for, I said we, our group, were the cherry blossoms were in bloom. The cherry trees were in bloom, excuse me. So the minute we heard that, I told Dad, the Allies have landed in Normandy.
Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
We were supposed to land at 6:30 on the morning of D-Day, what they call H hour. on June 6th of 1944. And we were aboard 2 British warships, 3 companies on one and 2 companies, 6 companies to the battalion, 3 companies on one and 3 companies on the other. And the first 3 companies went in at 6:30, and they went at Omaha Beach, which we called Omaha Red because it was almost a disaster. Later on, we found out that Eisenhower had even a little notation made as an announcement, possibly that possible withdrawal of the troops, because it got that bad. When we landed, our first companies landed at the exits of Veerville exit, which had bunkers and pillboxes firing directly into the landing forces. And many of the LCIs, LCTs, and the assault craft were hit, direct fire. Many of the company commanders and leading officers of the battalion were killed. And still, with all that, they couldn't break through the German defense line.
D-Day was almost not a comedy of errors. It was more just loaded with errors in the way we dropped. As a matter of fact, it was so bad, the drop was so bad for my particular battalion. I commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. I got as high as 2,900 feet across the channel. And, you know, we usually drop between 400 and 700 feet because the clouds were so heavy. We just started losing contact. Planes started to veer off to the right, to the left. Enemy air was attacking, anti-aircraft, the flares, all kinds of machine gun fire and planes crisscrossing. There's a big danger there when the planes start to get off, you know. You can only go one way. Definitely don't crowd into each other or you're going to crash or collide with each other. And it was a very, 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 very scary episode in my life. And still more interesting than all of that is when I landed, it was quiet. I said, my God, what happened? Where did everybody go? Meaning we were lost. And the whole battalion. I did not see my whole battalion for 5 whole days. I saw maybe 10 or 12 men, and then I'd lose 3 killed, and then I'd pick up 3 more from the 507th or from some other unit, and it was just constantly hit and go.
Utah Beach, which was further over, we didn't know at the time, but later on we found out they had no problem. They landed off, they didn't land on target, they landed a mile away, so they avoided the German defenses, but we went right into it. And they passed orders down that the beaches got so congested with men and torn equipment and half-sunk tanks. And our Navy could not fire anymore because they were afraid of hitting our own men. So they gave orders that the next 3 companies stay aboard ship, not to be sent in. And we waited 3 hours on deck, not knowing what to do, until finally around 9:30 in the morning, 3 hours later, they were told to man our assault ships. And we went over the side down cargo nets. When we landed into the assault craft and the ship started off, of course it was wobbling left and right in a heavy swell. We hit the shore and the ramp went down and we jumped in up to about waist in water. But what I saw really was scary because there was torn bodies, infantrymen from the first wave going in, the 6:30 wave going in. And some men had drowned with their full packs on and been washed ashore. Other men had been cut. You could see parts of limbs missing. Particularly, I guess those were part of the assault craft that had been hit in direct fire. By 9:30, the engineers had broken through the pillboxes, and we were able to get off the beach. It was about 400 feet to the seawall, and the Germans were firing long-range artillery into us. And there was big shell holes, big, tremendous artillery shell holes. And I heard one coming overhead. Now, we were used to hearing naval gunfire going overhead, so this thing was coming this way, what we called incoming mail. And I ran for this foxhole. It wasn't a foxhole, it was a shell crater. And I dove in. and I hit the bottom. I wasn't being heroic at that moment. I was going to hit, just was protecting myself. And there was the same lieutenant who was in the assault craft with me, standing on the side, and he was at the rim of the shell crater, and he was looking around. He was wanting to spot his men, see where the rest of the men of his platoon were. And I looked up and I said, "Hey, Lieutenant, get your head down." So, and just then the shell came in and exploded. And I just went to the bottom of the crater. If that crater was any deeper, I would have gotten into there. And I looked up, and there was the lieutenant still sitting there with his arm at the rim of the crater, but his head was gone.
One of the most traumatic experiences I had was killing my first man. Or I should put it reverse, seeing one of my own men killed first. And I took care of something else. And this man was, I'm going to use his name because he's dead now. His name was Pappy Cozile. We called him Pappy because he was the oldest paratrooper I had. The average age of my battalion was 18, and I was about 28. And Pappy was and I were with our small group on D-Day, the day we jumped, the next morning. We were running like heck, trying to stay away from the Germans where they were outnumbering us for fear that we wouldn't be able to get to our unit and fight as a unit. The important thing was to try to get that unit so I could get them together and fight. And we ran smack into some krauts, and we had a little firefight, and Pappy got smashed right with a bazooka and used for tanks. He got hit in the head and blew his head off, and his brains were splattered all over the place. And I saw there was no hope, that nobody could salvage him. So I took my morphine capsule and injected morphine and killed him. But I sat there for I don't know how long and just cried. As a matter of fact, that was my second time I cried. The first time I cried was when I couldn't find my battalion. Gee, 5 days for Pete's sake. Train, and it was an outfit. It was wonderful. And then to see poor Pappy, his brains blown up.
After we had established a beachhead at Normandy, we fought our way into the heart of France. We beat back the Nazi war machine in the cities and in the northern countryside. The dense terrain helped the Germans put up a tough defense.
After D-Day, when we finally broke through what they called the Normandy breakthrough, and then we were sent to this, what they call the bocage country, the hedgerows. And that was hell, because you were here, and the German was 2 yards behind you on the other side of this big mound of soil with plants coming through and trees and hedges. And the Germans on the other side, you could hear them talking on the other side, yet you couldn't see them. But you could stick a rifle through and fire, maybe you'll hit them. And this went on for weeks, this fighting at a heavy cost. And then till finally some young engineer devised, and I saw this tank come up, and they had big shears in front. And they would dig into these hedgerows and dig them up. And then the Germans would run, and we'd open fire on them. And little by little, we would break them down.
Southern France was the site of our next major landing. As we began to close a net around the Germans, photographer Carl Meidens was there. He captured the fear of the German prisoners.
One of the landings that I was on was the landing at Saint-Tropez on the coast of France on the 15th of August, 1944. We surprised the Germans, and we took hundreds of prisoners, and one of the and the prisoners were in such a large number, and were being overrun so quickly, especially by the French who had now joined us and were rougher with prisoners than we were. The Germans were frightened. and as they raised their hands to surrender, they had the expression on their faces quite common to surrendering prisoners in every war. Am I going to make this? Am I going to be killed as I stand here, or will I make it?
French liberation fighters battled the Germans in the streets of Paris. Blood was still being shed, and civilians had to duck sniper fire at every turn, hiding behind sandbags, trees, whatever they could find to protect them. Victory would not come easily. It had not been part of the Allied plan to liberate Paris at this time, but the revolt of the Parisians left the Allies no choice but to come to their aid. Danger could come from anywhere. Here a German soldier is shot dead in the street, while French freedom fighters, caught in a crossfire, rush to remove his weapon and cart off the corpse. After 4 years of occupation, they were willing to risk all for their freedom. More than 600 French citizens were killed during the liberation. The long days of darkness were over for the City of Light. Paris was liberated on August the 25th, 1944. The next day, General Charles de Gaulle marched with his countrymen up the Champs-Élysées. He declared, when asked about the resurrection of the Republic never ceased to exist. Black and Japanese Americans, among other minority groups, fought with distinction in the war, but first had to win a war at home. The Japanese were still being detained in internment camps, and only after agreeing to a loyalty oath taken by thousands of Japanese from behind barbed wire were they permitted to fight for their country in segregated units. When civil rights pioneer A. Philip Randolph called for equal opportunity in American defense work in 1941, President Roosevelt responded by forbidding racial and religious discrimination in war industries. Eleanor Roosevelt argued further on behalf of black Americans when she said, "A wind is rising throughout the world of free men, and they will not be kept in bondage." Soon after, the first U.S. Army flying school for black cadets was dedicated to Tuskegee, Alabama.
The Tuskegee Airmen is really a result of a confluence of circumstances. Confluence of A. Philip Randolph, the famous civil rights leader, demanding that blacks have equal pay for equal work in the defense plants, and that they be allowed to get into the top combat units. And as well, the efforts of Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who felt that blacks should be given the opportunity to participate like everyone else. So out of that, Franklin Roosevelt persuaded the Army to set up what really we call the Tuskegee Experiment, a group of the 99th Pursuit Squadron to train black young men to be fighter pilots.
The Tuskegee Airmen would serve by escorting bombers over places like Romania, Germany, Greece, and Italy.
One story I like to tell is while I was training in Tuskegee, I was forced to have a forced landing, and I landed on this white farmer's field. And I taxied up this P-47, and I wanted to go to the phone to call the base, and he came up there and said, "What you want, boy?" I said, "I'm Lieutenant Brown, and I need to call my base." He said, "Niggas can't fly in airplanes." I said, "I need to call my base, and if you don't get me to call my base, I'm going to turn this plane around and start these machine guns to working on you." So he called the base, and they came out, and they fixed the plane, and I took off. And he really did believe then that black folks could fly. So in that sense, we educated one farmer.
Japanese Americans served with honor. They also suffered a very high casualty toll, earning more than 3,600 Purple Hearts. They were among the most decorated men in American military history. Senator Daniel Inouye, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, was one of them.
Soon after December the 7th, the War Department decided that Japanese Americans were unfit for service. And so we were in the 4C or 4D category, enemy alien. And as such, we were not subjected to the draft. All our neighbors were, but not us. And we didn't have to sign up. And so some of us petitioned the government, signed petitions and requesting that we be accorded the privilege and honor of serving in uniform and to do anything. Whatever the country wanted us to do, we would be willing to do. And this petition drive went on for about a year, and the president came forth with an extraordinary statement saying Americanism is not a matter of skin or blood, it's a matter of mind and heart. My company commander was a Caucasian, but he was born in Hawaii. Tall, he had on his pilot's glasses, and he stood up very solemnly and he says, I am required by my commander to issue the following announcement. He paused, he hesitated. It pains me to tell you this, but I must tell you this. The government of Mississippi has declared that while you are here in Mississippi, you will be considered to be white people. And as such, you will be required to conduct yourself as white men. You will notice when you get out into the towns and villages that certain places are set aside for colored and for white. You will go to the white restaurants, you will go to the white toilets, you will drink from white faucets, and when you ride a bus, it will be in the front, not in the last 3 rows. It was stunned silence until a few would say, oh boy, we're white now.
By the end of 1944, Allied forces were lined up on Germany's eastern and western borders. The defeat of Adolf Hitler seemed imminent. In Italy, since the fall of Rome, the Germans had retreated from one defensive line to the next. Round-the-clock bombing was crushing Germany's major cities and its army. Meanwhile, Hitler, once Europe's master, blind to his increasingly hopeless military situation, was desperate for any new weapon that could turn the tide. Hitler's secret weapons were the V-bombs. The V-1, a 400-mile-per-hour jet-propelled missile, was referred to as the buzz bomb because of its terrifying noise. The V-2, a larger, more destructive model, soon followed. Hitler hoped to demoralize civilian populations by terrorizing them night and day. On June 13, 1944, the first V-1 was fired on London, launched from a ramp in northern France. More than 8,000 English citizens were lost to the V-bombs. On July the 20th, 1944, German officers tried to assassinate Hitler by planting a bomb at a meeting at his headquarters in East Prussia. Many German generals wanted out of the war, but knew the Führer would have to be eliminated first. The building was destroyed, but Hitler escaped. He concluded, "Nothing is fated to happen to me." Just hours after the attempt, he greeted Mussolini. One of Hitler's arms, temporarily paralyzed by the blast, was hidden under his coat.
They suspected Hitler was in a bunker and a bomb went off and injured Hitler. He took a terrible revenge. I think he killed 800 of people that he thought were involved in the plot to kill him. They also suspected Rommel. Rommel was then sent from the Afrika Korps way up on the Atlantic coast to deter the invasion, which was going to come. They suspected him of being involved, and the 2 generals called on him and said, You have a choice. We will not disturb your family, your wife, your son. You will get a state funeral. You will be considered a hero. And here's some poison. Now take it or deny that it happened. So he said goodbye to his wife and his son, got in the car, went with them, and took the poison.
Hitler's men faced disaster on the Eastern Front. The Soviets had recaptured much of the territory lost to Germany in the Nazi invasion of 1941. By the summer of 1944, the Russian offensive was in hot pursuit of the Germans. The Allies were closing in on the Reich from both directions. Every day seemed to bring news of victory to the Soviets from the Eastern Front. For millions, the horrors of occupation were ending. In July, the first Russian bombs landed near Warsaw. The Poles rose up against the occupying Nazi forces, expecting the nearby Soviets to come to their aid. Stalin, however, dismissed the Poles as criminal elements and forbade any assistance to them. After 63 days, the heroic Warsaw Uprising ended. More than 200,000 Polish lives had been lost. Roscoe Brown, Tuskegee fighter pilot, was in the middle of the action in the summer of '44.
I was leading a ground support mission attacking some rolling stock, some freight trains. And as I came down to attack this with my three planes that were flying with me, I dropped so low that when I went to shoot the railroad car, my wing hit it and knocked about half of the wing off, and I turned it to the side, and I grabbed it with both hands, and I righted it, and I flew it back with one wing and managed to come in and land it. But then I was telling the story of how this anti-aircraft blew a hole in my wing, and my crew chief started examining what was left of the wing, and he pulled out pieces of a boxcar with German writing on it. I had literally flown into a boxcar. It was about as close as I came to packing it in.
Tanks push into the wreck and ruin of the first major German city to be captured.
In September 1944, the war was brought for the first time to the Reich's doorstep as American troops fought for and soon captured the German city of Aachen.
The first day that we were close enough to the front lines to hear the fire and know that we were actually within firing range of the battlefield, actually it was at night. We had gone to bed in a dormitory-style building, and we could hear the bombs overhead, and that's when we truly were concerned and a little afraid. And I thought, gee, if I just thought back that this is South Dakota and we're having a thunderstorm, perhaps I can sleep. But it didn't help much. And then later on the night, the firing became so intense that we all moved down to the basement of this building.
In mid-1944, with the Nazis apparently on the brink of defeat, we could also focus on ending the war in the Pacific. Our objective was Tokyo. But first, we had to conquer the islands that form the defensive rings around Japan. In the next few months, we won a string of naval and island victories that brought down the government of Premier Tojo, the man who committed his country to the attack on Pearl Harbor. For the men who were part of the attacks on islands like the Marshalls and the Marianas, the dangers were many. The fighting was always fierce, but there were hazards other than enemy fire and malaria on these missions. William Manchester recalls a lost night in the Pacific.
My first day in combat was not very eventful. There was some small arms fire. There were no immediate casualties in our battalion. We did capture a case of Japanese rice wine, and there were 24 bottles, and 23 of the bottles had white labels, and one had a salmon-colored label. We couldn't read Japanese. We didn't know that the salmon-colored label meant that bottle was sake, very potent. Well, as it turned out, I wound up with a sake bottle. And they said there was a great rainstorm, and I didn't know the rain was pelting down on me, but I was out. And the next day, we had to go into action, and I felt absolutely wretched. Worst hangover of my life.
We took Saipan in the Marianas. Of 30,000 Japanese defenders, over 27,000 were killed in the invasion.
The challenge at Saipan was again to basically secure the island against any possible use by the Japanese, so they could not later interfere with our inevitable march to the Japanese mainland.
By the middle of 1944, we were well on our way. Now we're about to invade Guam, more than 1,000 miles to the west. And here again was the same familiar pattern of island hopping in the
Guam, the largest of the Marianas, was our next target. The Marines were determined to recapture this U.S. territory lost to the Japanese in 1941. But the troops often had to fight boredom before they had a chance to fight the enemy.
The men who landed on Guam were on transport for 59 days, 2 months. They had to wait until Saipan was secure. Well, on a troop ship, you're not allowed on deck, no exercise, and over 2 months of lying in bunks, your muscles atrophy. The men had to hit the beach and fight, and it was a contested landing in that condition. So they did it. They did it because of adrenaline and because they were enraged, but not entirely at the Japanese. They were enraged at their commanders.
In 42, MacArthur had promised to return to the Philippines. Carl Meidens was there in 45 to capture the historic moment.
I climbed up on the ramp of the landing craft, prepared to jump onto the ramp and turn around quickly and make a picture of MacArthur as he stepped onto the ramp. But even as I was jumping, I heard the engines on the landing craft reversed, and I turned around and saw that the landing craft was now backing away from the beach. And I knew at once what was happening, having spent a long time covering MacArthur. And so I ran dry-shod up the landing platforms to the beach, and I ran along the beach dry-shod while the landing craft paralleled the beach some distance from the landing platforms. And I turned around, and the LCV and the landing craft headed in for the beach and dropped its ramp in knee-deep water, and MacArthur waded ashore, and I took the picture of MacArthur wading ashore.
When I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return.
Well, we had a highly distorted image of MacArthur. MacArthur was vain and he was pompous, and we had nothing but contempt for him. We didn't realize the greatnesses of his generalship. It wasn't so much later that, comparing casualty figures, I realized that a GI fighting under MacArthur had a much better chance of survival than any Marine. But, well, there were all sorts of preposterous myths that angered people. Rumors about MacArthur. For example, on New Guinea, MacArthur was rumored to have had his own private cow. That sounds absurd, but when we were in the Pacific, nobody had milk out there. Milk was of distant memory. And if MacArthur had a private cow and had his own milk, we were prepared to kill him.
After MacArthur's triumphant return, there still remained a large garrison of Japanese soldiers to overcome in the Philippines. The campaign would last about 5 months. It appeared that both in the Pacific and in Europe, our enemy's ability to take the offensive had been crushed. On one of these fronts, we were about to be proven wrong. In December of 1944, a surprise attack by the Germans, which drove a bulge through our defensive lines, would take more American lives than any other battle of the war. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler, quite impulsively, decided his thrust would be through the Ardennes toward Antwerp, saying, "This battle is to decide whether we shall live or die." This quiet part of Belgium was manned largely by green American soldiers. The attack on December the 16th, in the midst of a bitterly cold winter, was aided by heavy cloud cover which grounded the Allies' superior air power. American soldiers were taken completely by surprise, but it wasn't long before General Eisenhower realized this was a major offensive. He acted quickly to flatten the bulge the Germans had created. George Kyrikopoulos, a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge, saw action in the struggle for the pivotal town of Bastogne, under siege by the Germans.
We mounted tanks of the 4th Armored Division, and they told us we're breaking through to relieve Bastogne. And we were on this road, and there's heavy snow. It was snowing that morning. As we reached this road, we looked and we saw these heads pop out from foxholes. And we thought they were enemy, and we jumped off because we were afraid of being hit while riding tanks. And that's the worst thing you could do, is be run into a machine gun nest or into an artillery fire while you're riding tanks. You had no protection for yourself. So we jumped off the tanks, and there's always a 6 to 7 foot drop from the top of the tank down. And then all these men came out and up to us and says, "Hey guys, hey, we're GIs, we're GIs." And then we realized that these were our own men. And afterwards, we found out in the Stars and Stripes, 2 weeks later, that this was Bastogne that we had relieved.
Hitler's gamble, for which he had drafted every available German from age 16 to 60, did not pay off. Though confusion and chaos reigned initially, we were soon able to thwart the German offensive and launch a counterattack.
The German soldiers looked so pitiful because they were retreated. You could see them walking across the field. You see them all, and anywhere you looked, there was a dead soldier, American or German. So they must have passed all their friends here and realized what the feudal stage. Don't forget it had snow too. So the snow was all over the ground, so you could really see everything. And these German soldiers just did not want to fight anymore.
As the Battle of the Bulge subsided, it became clear that the Germans had been routed. At the same time, German atrocities came to light, such as the Normandy massacre, where SS troops murdered nearly 100 unarmed American POWs. Germany had exhausted its last resources in this final bid for victory and suffered 100,000 casualties. American losses numbered almost 77,000 killed, wounded, or missing. We knew we had finally broken the German army. By early 1945, victory was within sight. America's confidence as a nation was at an all-time high. Our stunning military successes around the world had ensured our place as a dominant leader in the post-war world, and had helped Franklin Roosevelt with an unprecedented 4th term as president. In his last inaugural address, President Roosevelt presented us with a blueprint for the future. "We have learned," said FDR, "that we cannot live alone, that the only way to have a friend is to be one."